the Endangerment Finding and Petrochemicals. For context, the Endangerment Finding is the scientific and legal foundation for the Environmental Protection Agency's ability to regulate climate emissions. So this is really, really important and really foundational. Thanks for the recording. So again, while this has been in place, the endangerment finding has been in place since 2009. The Trump administration's EPA is now seeking to rescind it as part of their larger deregulatory agenda, which threatens public health, it threatens air pollution, and we're going to talk about that today, and specifically the implications on petrochemicals and plastic pollution. But I'm Sam Schmitz, a project manager here at Moms Clean Air Force, and I'm lucky to be joined by Moms Clean Air Force director and co-founder Dominique Browning, along with some other really esteemed guests. Dominique, what do you think of the Trump EPA's effort to rescind the endangerment finding?
That is what we call a very easy softball. I am furious. All of us at Moms Clean Air Force are appalled and disgusted by this effort. This gigantic deregulatory push is based on lousy science. It doesn't make sense economically, and it sure doesn't make any sense when it comes to protecting our health or the health of our children, who are the most vulnerable to climate and air disasters. That's exactly what I told the EPA when I testified a few weeks ago, and I hope everyone listening today will join us in telling EPA what a mistake it is to try to roll back climate protections from any sector, especially the transportation sector, a huge contributor. This administration has abandoned EPA's mission to protect human health and the environment in favor of big corporate polluters from the fossil fuel and petrochemical industries. This EPA is morally bankrupt. I come at this from the perspective of a mother and a grandmother. The endangerment finding means that EPA has a responsibility to cut the climate pollution that's throwing off the stability of our climate. And a stable climate is the only way for human civilization to thrive. The next generations will inherit greater chaos and danger. But let's be clear, right now, we are feeling the impacts of climate change across the country and across the world because warming air and warming oceans are turbocharging extreme weather.
Yeah, thanks, Dominique. I mean, the way that I think about this too is that there's been scientific consensus that climate change is not just real, but an existential threat for my entire life. This finding was from 2009, and even before that, there was scientific consensus. So again, this is just a really ridiculous deregulatory move. But we know that greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuels, which create dirty energy, but also petrochemicals and plastics, cause global warming and climate change. And as climate change supercharges extreme weather, it's going to create more chemical disasters. And I know our guests are going to talk about that even more. But basically, this creates a sort of vicious cycle of creating these chemical disasters that release more climate emissions and then create more extreme weather as a result. But again, we have some really wonderful and esteemed experts here today to talk about this that I'll pass it over to in just a minute. But first, we're joined by Cynthia Palmer, a petrochemical expert from our team at Moms Clean Air Force, who recently conducted an analysis on the endangerment finding and petrochemical disasters. We're also joined by Dr. Leo Trasande. He's the director of NYU's Center for Investigation of Environmental Hazards. He's also a professor in pediatrics and environmental medicine, and some of his most well-known research documents that endocrine disrupting chemicals cost the US $340 billion annually. And our last guest is Jo Banner. She's the co-founder of the Descendants Project, which is an organization dedicated to justice for the descendants of enslaved Black Americans living in the river parishes of Louisiana, which have now become known as Cancer Alley due to the concentration of toxic petrochemical buildout in their community. With that, Dominique, I'll pass it back to you to interview Cynthia about her new analysis.
Thank you so much, Sam. First of all, I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. When we talk about petrochemicals, we're talking about the productions of plastics, pesticides, fertilizers, and other things. This is a huge and exploding sector. Every time I go to the grocery store, for instance, I find yet another fruit or vegetable wrapped in an unnecessary layer of plastic. It's like there's a room somewhere where people dream up ways to inject more plastic into our lives. Cynthia has just produced a really fascinating analysis of the petrochemical industry and the endangerment finding, the links between them. I was very surprised to learn how much climate pollution the petrochemical sector contributes. Could you talk about that? How is the production of the plastics and fertilizers and pesticides we use every single day in all parts of our lives? How does that tie to petrochemical disasters and climate charged extreme weather events?
Hey, thank you so much, Dominique. I'm happy to talk about this. Well, not happy. The pollution from combusting fossil fuels is putting floods, fires, and hurricanes on steroids. EPA Administrator Zeldin is trying to emasculate his own agency, stripping EPA of the legal basis for controlling climate pollution. The proposal jeopardizes clean air rules that protect us from climate heating pollutants and threaten to usher in a future of catastrophic chemical disasters, including leaking pipelines, burning and exploding petrochemical facilities, and flooding hazardous waste dumps. And doubly sickening, this attempted rescission of the endangerment finding is happening at the very same time that EPA is dismantling protections against the resulting chemical disasters. As for the role of plastics, plastics are one of the main drivers of these climate and petrochemical emergencies. Plastics are made from oil, gas, and coal, combined with toxic chemicals such as phthalates and heavy metals and PFAS. They are the fastest growing source of industrial greenhouse gas emissions, and it is predicted that by 2040, as much as 19% of global greenhouse gas emissions will come from plastics. The fossil fuel industry is on track to triple plastics production by mid-century. As if we need more plastic? Every step of the petrochemical supply chain releases greenhouse gases and hazardous air pollutants, and these emissions heat the Earth's climate and intensify extreme weather events, which trigger chemical disasters. It is a self-reinforcing loop of destruction with the fossil fuel and petrochemical industry at its core. Back to you, Dominique.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's a lot to take in. I myself really was unaware of the magnitude of the problem here. And it's very helpful for you to connect the dots for people. We know that the dots are very strong. They're not even dots, they're strong lines between global warming and extreme weather, right? Warmer skies, warmer air, warmer oceans turbocharge things like hurricanes and flooding. Cynthia, talk a little bit about the next, I don't even want to say dotted line, the next bright red line going from turbocharged weather to chemical disasters, petrochemical disasters, which, as you point out, because of the toxic chemicals that are being used, are even more lethal than other kinds of disasters.
Yeah. So I'll start with where this is all happening. And as we will hear from our friend Joe Banner in just a few minutes, many of the highest risks will fall on the lowest income families and people of color residing in the southeastern United States. Nearly 4.5 million people live within 1.5 miles of 872 highly hazardous chemical facilities along the Gulf Coast. And what is happening is there's toxic emissions at every step of the supply chain of plastics. And these emissions begin before the extreme weather even arrives. When storms are on the horizon, petrochemical facilities release massive amounts of flammable and explosive fossil gases into surrounding communities. We're talking additional thousands of tons of benzene, dioxins, and other hazardous air pollutants. And it takes only
Stop right there. It's so shocking. Why do they release them ahead of a storm?
So these gases are explosive and flammable. And so as not to enable their own facilities to blow up, they release them through processes called flaring, which is burning in an open flame, or simply venting, which is releasing directly into the atmosphere and into communities. So these vented and flared toxic air pollutants are going right out into the air surrounding these facilities before the storms even arrive, and then during and after too. The facilities just keep venting and flaring. And already the US averages one chemical spill, fire, or explosion every 3 days. Wow. But Administrator Zeldin's attacks almost guarantee an increase. Floods, firestorms, and tornadoes can damage petrochemical equipment, and the high winds can topple chemical storage tanks, as we saw happening in Hurricanes Rita and Katrina. Some chemical disasters happen from power outages. For example, at the Arkema chemical plant in Crosby, Texas, where more than 3 feet of floodwaters damaged the refrigeration systems that are meant to keep toxic chemicals from decomposing and igniting. Pipelines are involved as well. We have millions of miles of pipelines crisscrossing the country, carrying flammable and explosive fossil fuels. In Satartia, Mississippi, for example, a pipeline carrying carbon dioxide used in oil drilling exploded from the floods, spewing carbon dioxide for hours. The carbon dioxide displaced oxygen in the air. Car engines stopped running, and people could not escape. Carbon dioxide emissions can cause heart malfunctions and death by asphyxiation. Back to you, Dominique.
You've answered some of my questions coming up, but talk a little bit about how do you clean things up? What happens to hazardous waste during these extreme weather events? They go into our water, they go into our air, as you are so vividly describing threats of asphyxiation. Of course, air doesn't stop at state lines, right? It keeps moving across the country. So what happens after an extreme weather event?
Thank you. All good questions, lots to unpack there. With regard to hazardous wastes, the US has hazardous wastes in virtually every state. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans lives within 3 miles of a hazardous waste dump. And studies have concluded that well over half of the nation's Superfund hazardous waste sites are at high risk from hurricanes, floods, wildfires, sea level rise, and other climate events, with the potential to release toxic wastes into our neighborhoods, contaminating our water and our air. And the thing about hazardous waste sites is that the caps that cover the hazardous wastes are often nothing more than thin layers of clay or earth, concrete or sand placed on top of extremely toxic chemicals. The government used to try and clean up toxic waste dump sites, but it gave up in the 1990s, and the EPA instead began covering these sites and leaving the chemicals in place. And these coverings, the sand, the clay, concrete, are no match for the increasingly powerful hurricanes, floods, fires, and storm surges. And hundreds of these toxic waste sites have flooded. For example, during Hurricane Harvey, one of the Superfund sites that flooded was the dioxin-laden San Jacinto waste pits. The protective concrete cap was smashed by 16 feet of water, sending the dioxins downstream. EPA later found dioxins in the river sediments at 2,300 times the EPA cleanup standard. Back to you, Dominique.
If that isn't a bright red line between the turbocharged weather caused by climate change and the petrochemical industry dangers, I don't know what is. And as you point out, these sites are all over the country. They don't have signs on them saying, I am a hazardous waste site. How do people find out what's going on in their backyards?
It's a good question. Oftentimes they don't find out. Literally, people get sick all the time, not knowing what killed them, not knowing about their own toxic exposures. And even my very best girlfriend, who lived in Texas amidst petrochemical facilities, when she died, we thought it was just bad luck. And then a little research pointed to the 9 hazardous chemical manufacturing facilities that were right near her home, some of them just a mile away. So sometimes bad luck turns out to be something much more insidious.
Thank you, Cynthia. And we have up on our site at Mom's Clean Air Force maps and tools to find out what is in your backyard and what can be done. But as Cynthia says, it's not all there. It's maybe hiding in plain sight, but it is still hiding. Really a horrific situation, and one that I think most of us were blithely unaware of, right? Until we started really paying attention to this kind of work. Dr. Trasande, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've got a very, very busy schedule as well. Thank you, Cynthia, for laying out the connections and the backdrop. May I call you Leo? We've been talking
Leo's fine. Please, good to be here.
We've been talking about the connections between petrochemicals and the endangerment finding, global warming, and I would love for you to switch us to talking about petrochemical pollution and why it's so dangerous to our bodies and to children's bodies in particular. You are a medical expert. I have heard you speak many times, actually, recently last year, and highly value how clear and precise you are about what's going on.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I mean, kids are uniquely vulnerable for all sorts of reasons. They have developing organ systems, and you can't rewind those windows of development, be they for the lungs, for the brain, for the hormone system that regulates so many basic biological functions. So we talk a lot about early origins of adult disease, and it's no secret that when you impair child development, their effects reverberate for the entire lifespan in various and insidious ways. So, in addition, kids also have higher ingestion inhalation rates per pound. So they have higher exposure compared to us adults at the same exposure levels in air, water, food, etc. And they have long.
You just right on that. Can you just clarify for people? I don't think people think about, how little lungs, you have to breathe more, et cetera. Just be a little more graphic about that.
Sure. I mean, they breathe more frequently. They have higher oxygen and other needs per pound body mass. And so they inhale at a higher rate, and that gives them a higher exposure, even if there's the same particulate matter pollution, for example, in the air. So they'll carry higher body burden of certain chemicals compared to adults, for example.
Great. Thank you. We've talked a lot about why petrochemicals are so dangerous to human health, and a big one is that they disrupt our hormones. You literally wrote the book on hormone disrupting chemicals. So can you break that down for us? Talk to us about the endocrine system. Talk to us about what it means to interrupt the hormone system.
Sure. So hormones are signaling molecules at a very basic level. They underlie nearly every biological function to humankind: temperature, metabolism, salt, sugar, and even sex. And hormones work at extremely low levels. They're by design very potent molecules. They're natural molecules. And when we're talking about endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs, or hormone disrupting chemicals, we're talking about synthetic chemicals that exist in human experience at the same range. Salt pebbles in the proverbial Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's the range of exposure we're talking about. So we're talking about chemicals that are competing, literally in some cases, with our natural hormones and hacking those molecular functions, leading to rewiring of development and consequences that can run the entire lifespan. We know that babies are born too soon because of hormone disrupting chemicals. Their growth is restricted, setting them up for higher risk of childhood obesity, as well as even adult consequences such as obesity, again, and diabetes and cardiovascular disease. It affects reproductive development, setting them up for potentially a higher risk of infertility in later life, but also reduced potency and other consequences. And so the consequences for hormonal development can run across both sexes, run across the entire lifespan, can even manifest in certain reproductive organ system cancers or hormone sensitive cancers. The chemicals we're talking about in general that are petrochemically derived include the phthalates that are used to soften plastic materials like polyvinyl chloride, bisphenols used in aluminum can linings and thermal paper receipts. They're monomers of polycarbonate plastic. These are chemicals that are used increasingly in materials in our lifestyle because in many ways, as we focus on climate change and there's pressure to reduce petrochemical production, they're looking for an off-ramp functionally, and that off-ramp is increasingly plastic production. And unfortunately, we know that plastics also have other consequences because they break down, they generate micro nanoplastics. Those are probably not acting purely by themselves. Yes, they're human wrecking balls, they're particles. They can tear into tissues. But they're likely toxic drug delivery systems for the chemicals I alluded to, and others that we don't fully understand. We know of 16,000 chemicals used in plastic. We only have toxicity testing data for 4,000. So there's so much we don't even know about the consequences, and yet we're talking about a large disease and disability burden that particularly affects children as a result of these chemicals.
You've also talked about links to cancer. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the links to cancer are, for petrochemicals, most directly described in communities where fossil fuels are produced or plastic production occurs. And particularly, I know of studies in Louisiana and other parts of the country where that's been best described. But what we know, for example, about phthalates and bisphenols, whether they're because they're estrogenic or antagonize the male sex hormone testosterone, those can both have effects on breast cancer risk as well as prostate cancer risk. We know, in addition, that the ovary is uniquely susceptible to the effects of bisphenols, and there are suggestive studies suggesting increases in risk of ovarian cancer, at least from the laboratory, less so from humans. And then when you talk about the thyroid gland, there are studies documenting serious concerns about the brominated flame retardants, the older chemicals that are used in many cases in plastic to prevent them from burning in devices and such. It's not great to have an iPhone burn up, understandably, but increasingly we also understand that the replacements for the brominated flame retardants, which have largely started to find their way to phase out, we know that the organophosphate flame retardants have many of the same molecular characteristics and indeed themselves have been associated with thyroid cancer. And so that's just scratching the surface of a bigger problem. Many of the studies I am talking about, admittedly, are what we call case control studies. They're populations where there's a cancer diagnosis and then they've been able to put together some kind of comparison group to really delineate it. Those are the first stage of epidemiologic studies. Ideally, you'd want larger cohorts and more specific molecular signals to piece the proverbial dots. But there's large evidence for action supported by laboratory evidence that supports that carcinogenicity.
So really underlying everything you're saying, I am hearing the message loud and clear that this is not a time when we should be rolling back protections for human health, rolling back the release of climate pollution, which then causes disasters, which then release more poison. This is a time when we should be tripling and quadrupling down on research and on investments on the impacts of all of these on our bodies. It's a pretty amazing and horrific problem. Do you feel ever surprised by something new or something new that you stumbled upon, or, you know, what's keeping you up, and what are your moments of, oh my God, this is worse than I thought?
So I think the current administration has brought some interesting and conflicting elements of momentum. So we're keenly aware of the MAGA efforts, if you will, to roll back EPA protections, including the Endangerment Finding. But we also have the Make America Healthy Again elements that appeared to show so much promise. Yet right now, I think we're all waiting for the execution of those elements. If we're really serious about getting food contact materials out of concern, out of food, through doing the generally recognized as safe loophole, for example, we have to take action, and that's going to require some confronting industry, whether it's the food industry or the chemical industry or the petrochemical industry, to take the actions that are needed. So I often am in some interesting discussions with people I don't usually agree with or don't or don't agree with on many things. But the element of success here is to be practical and focus on the wins we can achieve. And I still do believe there are opportunities for positive progress in the context of the MAHA movement.
I'm glad to hear that you have some optimism here. One of the reasons we started Mom's Clean Air Force, it's hard to believe this was 12 or 13 years ago. There was a new thing called mommy bloggers. And I noticed that a lot of the women who were blogging were deeply, deeply concerned about their children's health, especially around issues like bisphenol, endocrine disruptors. But everybody wanted to figure out how to buy the right solution. What's the baby bottle that's safe? What can I do? And clearly, a problem of such epic proportions needs systemic change. And that's what Mom's Clean Air Force is fighting for. And these are changes that should be based on science and on strong medicine, not on simply anxiety, though there sure is a lot to be anxious about. Thank you so much, Dr. Trasande and Leo. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, I learn something every time we speak with you.
Thank you so much.
Next, I'm very honored to welcome Joe Banner, who is the co-founder of the Descendants Project. Hi there, there you are. Joe, welcome back, and thanks for being here. We know that the people living closest to petrochemical facilities often experience the first and worst impacts of petrochemical disasters. Many of the worst affected communities are economically disadvantaged and people of color. Can you talk about how this outsized petrochemical build-out in communities of color compounds other economic, social, and health disparities? I often talk about how we are now in a time when the administration is making it easier to get sick and harder to get better. How do you think about this?
Thank you for inviting me and allowing me to share my story. When I think about the health issues we're facing from pollution, I really connected to our area's history of enslavement and that plantation system that violated the human rights of my ancestors and created a sacrifice zone. So the backbone of this country has been by sacrificing certain groups, Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color, to the extent that now that vulnerability is still within our communities, and we have to push back against an economy that wants to continue to sacrifice us. But the way that I see it, the compounded impact of pollution is one that stands out. My area in Louisiana is known as Cancer Alley. It's a stretch between New Orleans and Baton Rouge that has over 200 industrial facilities, many of them connected to the production of plastic. But within Cancer Alley, we are, as the name implies, as cancer, but it could be heart attack alley, it could be anxiety alley, asthma alley. All of these are just some of the health impacts that we face. But what I didn't realize, if I can just give a little brief example of how these things compound, yesterday or the day before, I went to my doctor just for a 6-month checkup, routine checkup, and my doctor noticed that I had like high blood pressure. And usually my blood pressure has been very normal, but that day it was higher. And he asked me, he's like, I don't like that your numbers are high, your blood pressure is high. Like, have you been stressed out? And I said, well, I have been, more anxious, but also when I'm anxious, I eat sunflower seeds. Like, that's my way of dealing with anxiety, is to eat sunflower seeds. So my doctor was like, listen, you are a Black woman in your, in your 40s. You cannot have salt like this. You cannot have sunflower seeds. But it's just my way of showing like the anxiety that we're going through leads me to eat food like maybe I should be away from, causing me to have another underlying problem. So like, and it's all related, right? Because of the anxiety I face a lot of the times dealing with environmental issues. So not to make light of all the other stuff, and I promise Dr. Leo, I'm cutting out the sunflower seeds and dealing with my stress another way. But I just wanted to show like how these little small things, we think about the problems too, but how even like the anxiety can compound and then you're in a serious health situation.
That is a vivid example, and I think one a lot of people are going to relate to. I want to go back, well, first of all, to two things. One, sacrifice zones. That's such a powerful term, sacrifice zones. And whether or not you live in one or near one or hundreds of miles away, we should all stop a moment and think about, do we want to be a country where sacrifice zones are okay? Really an important question. You mentioned Cancer Alley. I know that childhood leukemia rates, for example, are off the charts in Cancer Alley. Talk a little bit about the impacts that you're seeing and hearing about in communities. What are people around you saying and talking about in terms of family impacts? You're on mute.
Sorry.
There
Yeah,
you go.
thank you. We're seeing multi-generations dealing with cancer and other sicknesses, but it's really sad to hear of the stories where the grandparent has cancer, the parent may or aunt or uncle have cancer, and then the child has cancer too. So these are like the realities too. It's normal to have cancer throughout all these different branches of your family, or to have your neighborhood or your friends impacted by different types of sicknesses, especially cancer. And I want to also uplift that our kids are going to school, and where they are dealing, they may be sick, they may have a sick relative. In fact, they probably have a sick relative, and they're also dealing with climate issues. So our children are facing school. Sometimes they may have been relocated from their home because, for example, we had Hurricane Ida 4 years ago. Some people still aren't back in their homes after that hurricane devastated the area. So now, like our students, our younger kids have to go to school and somehow learn in these types of conditions. And then combine that with the location of the schools, because sometimes your school will literally be right on or very close to the fence line of huge plants. So they're also taking in this environmental degradation around their school. And like school is supposed to be a safe space, right? And just knowing that they can't escape the harms that come from the pollution and the impacted air and water and land, there is no escape for them. And it really is, it presents itself in lower test scores with the children not really being able to advance in the way that one would think they should.
Yeah, and we're talking about plastics here, but again, petrochemicals are also fertilizers and pesticides, which means that these toxic chemicals are getting into children's foods, into food that might be served at school, at home, anywhere. It's hard to see how you escape it, right?
It's beyond that, and thanks for uplifting that because we have sugarcane fields all around us, and the sugarcane is sprayed. In fact, where I'm sitting right now in Wallace, I can't even look out. I can't even see my neighbor's house right now because the sugarcane is so high, and that is how close sugarcane is around us and surrounding schools, surrounding residents, and yeah, and that gets sprayed. We have crop dusters that come through and spray, or when the sugarcane will be cut, the ground, the cane is burned. And so like all of the fertilizer and the pesticides on it is then released into the air through that burning.
So when there are, well, I just actually want to stop a moment and say, I am so sorry to hear about that. And it is something that you live with through the entire season of harvesting, growing and harvesting. When there are extreme weather events, which are tied to global warming, climate change, climate emissions, to bring this back to the endangerment finding, how do extreme weather events impact communities, your community, other communities living near petrochemical facilities?
Well, we have to, as I mentioned before, we had Hurricane Ida in 2021, and I have never felt a storm of that magnitude before. We rode that storm out because we reflected on when Hurricane Katrina hit. We are far enough away from New Orleans. We weren't necessarily in the bullseye, but our community actually, we were, it was okay. It wasn't the devastation of New Orleans. We had damage. So we figured that we could, that we could ride out a storm with Ida because it was not predicted to be the storm that it was. But when we were there and the warming Gulf just was, the waters were perfect, literally perfect storm water. And when Hurricane Ida hit the area, it came in as like a 4, and it was only predicted to be a 2. And I've never just hearing the wind and the roaring of the wind for 14 hours. And then I thought halfway through the storm, wow, there is industry around us. So if I'm concerned about our roof blowing off, what's the industry around us? What is their like emergency plan? How are we going to escape that? If infrastructure goes down? And it was a reality, I think, from what I hear, had the storm rage for one more hour, that would have been critical infrastructure failure. So, we look at the impact of those storms and those plants being able to sustain that. And also after the storm hits, that's the burning off of the chemicals. So oftentimes the plants are down, they have these chemicals stored, and they have to get it out into like from their plant to reduce the risk of explosion. So that's like a lot more flaring and burning the chemicals off. And our communities are exposed to that air, especially considering that we may not have power. So we don't have air conditioners. The best way we can cool ourselves is by sitting outside in the pollution.
And it's very hard to get away, and it is home, right? So, what kind of communications do you get from the surrounding industries when there are disasters? Do they measure? Do they monitor? Do they communicate?
Yes. And I mean, no, they don't. And even what they do communicate a little bit that they do is not that we can trust, because it's just, it's like, I always compare, I think they have Willy Wonka petrochemical plants because they're the only type of plants that don't produce any type of pollution. You can have an explosion that does not go beyond the fence line with a mesh fence. So I'm not sure how they've been able to create these magical plants, but somehow they will share those narratives about how we're not in danger when we can clearly see. We had in 2023, Marathon had a few of their tanks catch fire in St. John Parish. And I remember seeing multiple cop cars and fire trucks going to the scene. I did not hear one siren throughout that whole entire incident. The community never heard anything. And so, but they were going to the fire, but we would never even warn, even like the fire trucks didn't have their sirens on.
Wow. It's shocking. I know that the community that you represent and all of the communities in that area have been let down by EPA for generations. And even while the Clean Air Act has done so much to clean up air in some places, it has not done enough anywhere, and certainly not done enough in your communities. That said, it's now getting worse again. We're going backwards just when we were starting to feel a glimmer of things are going to get better, more attention, more investment, more of everything. What is your message to Administrator Lee Zeldin right now?
Well, my message is that you can't escape this. And I know that it may feel, and it is, we get the pollution first and worst, but it doesn't mean that you don't get it second and doesn't come to you. It is coming to you. I look at what's happening with the farmers and looking at these conservative communities that who have backed who have backed this administration, who have backed this president, believing that when that the policies would save them should crunch time. Well, you're seeing farmers come out and they're losing crops and they're losing their farms and they are crying and they are really scared right now because guess what? The conditions that we have been facing and the climate change that we have been seeing and the policies that have been put in place to protect industry are now hitting them where it really hurts. And so like if one part, if any of us are weak, that is weakness that all of us will experience one day or another. So, what's the quote? If they come for me in the morning, they'll come for you at night. And we really are seeing people facing a lot of nighttime right now because of like policies that do not protect the people, and we can't escape it. So, I actually urge this administration and the EPA to look at us as allies in this fight and protecting everybody. We shouldn't be adversaries. It shouldn't matter who's the president or not. Health should be our number one concern. I don't understand how one can say just because I follow a conservative administration, that means the planet doesn't matter. That means that health doesn't matter. There have been many people, even throughout like our spiritual realms, that have touted the protection of the planet and protection of people and social justice and human rights. So, yeah, I would urge the EPA to really look at the circumstances right now and to understand there is no escape. You can't control the environment to that extent.
And I think that's very moving and very wise. Why can't we all be colleagues in reining in pollution and cleaning things up? And why do we have to pit one group against another? It's just common sense to try and work for a healthier country, healthier people. Right now, the chemical industry is launching huge efforts to build what they call advanced recycling plants. And these are going all over the country. And they're being called recycling plants, even though they are simply burning plastic waste, which means plastic pollution, as you say, is coming to your backyard, whether you're in Connecticut, California, Louisiana. So again, rather than starting out and getting the pollution controls on at the beginning, we have to fight. And it seems almost surreal that we have to fight to protect our health. We will get your message out loud and clear. And I know you have done an extraordinary job of speaking for and with your community, Joe Banner. So thank you so much. Do you want to say a little bit about the Descendants Project? We introed you before you got here, but we didn't go too much into it. So I'd love to hear, as you close, a few words.
Yeah, thank you for that. Our organization was created to, first of all, acknowledge and preserve the history of the enslaved Africans, our ancestors who were brought to this area, as I mentioned before, to work the plantation system. I am 10th generation Louisianian. My family's been here over 300 years. So there's been a lot of a lot that they have impacted through this community. But what we're also seeing, we're proud of our heritage, but that heritage, unfortunately, also comes with that sacrifice of Black bodies tag, and that has really plagued our health. And so our organization is really also about protecting the descendant community, really pushing back against harmful systems rooted in the plantation system, including the pollution, the petrochemical subsidies, and everything else that comes from that sacrifice. And so we advocate all over the world. We advocate in a very local level. We're also, in United Nations spaces, making sure that the voices of fence line communities like ours can be heard.
Thank you so much for everything you do. It's an honor to have you join us, and I am filled with admiration for your work and your fighting spirit. So thank you. Thank you. I hope we will get these messages over to Administrator Zeldin. Everybody needs to hear them. And I hope, again, that all of you who are listening have a better idea and more sense of urgency for why it is so important to act. We can't do nothing, and we can't think, oh, what difference does it make? My voice. Every voice matters. So for that reason, I'm really pleased to turn this back over to Sam my colleague, Sam Schmitz, who's going to talk about how to fight back to protect the endangerment finding.
Thanks, Dominique. And thanks again, Joe and Leo and Cynthia. An inspiration as always. I'm going to wrap things up by teaching all of you how to officially submit your public comment to EPA. We've got a few slides to show you. But basically, we're going to talk about written comments here and how you can submit them to the Environmental Protection Agency. If we could get those slides pulled up, that would be awesome. And we will also drop that link in the chat. Thanks for sharing that. This is sort of like a one-page takeaway in the chat there, where you can see what we're talking about right now so that you can have it after the fact. I'll wait until the slides get up for 1 second, but I'll just talk through what written comments are. So basically the EPA has to take feedback from each of us. It has to take comments from citizens. It has to take feedback from us. These government agencies are beholden to the people. And so they've officially launched this effort to rescind the endangerment finding. But now it's the period of time now through September 22nd, where they're taking public comments via the docket, which is available online. We'll share the link at the end of this. Basically, the most compelling public comments are ones that share your authentic story. So one that builds emotional urgency, ones that move people emotionally. And Moms Clean Air Force has submitted tons and tons of public comments. We've orally testified at the EPA a few weeks ago, and we have this down to sort of a science. So our comment template for you is basically 4 parts. It's an introduction and a clear ask not to rescind the endangerment finding. And then the most important part is telling your story. Why does climate change matter to you? Why does the endangerment finding matter to you? And then after that, you want to weave in the facts to make sure that, you know, your story has a lot of legitimacy. And then you just conclude it by reiterating that you want to protect the endangerment finding. We can go to the next slide. Perfect. So you can use this introduction verbatim. So you're going to say your name. My name is Sam Schmitz, and I'm from DC, or I'm from Illinois. That's where I grew up, depending on the sort of story that you're telling. I urge the EPA to not rescind the endangerment finding. It's crucial to protect our communities and future generations from the impacts of climate warming pollution. So you really just want to hit the points of your name, your location. You don't want to share your address or anything like that because this is public record, but you want to share the state that you're in, or the district or wherever. And then you put this sort of general ask. We can go to the next one. So then the most important part, again, is what your story is. So why do you care about climate change? How has it affected you, your family, your community? How do you think about it affecting your future or your kids' future or your grandkids' future? Is there a certain type of extreme weather that has hit close to home? So again, we heard from Joe Banner and others about how petrochemical disasters are affecting them, right? So, you know, that's probably the story that you would tell. Other people would tell stories about wildfires in their community. I often talk about air pollution because I have asthma. Other folks are affected by floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards, extreme heat. It's been a crazy extreme heat summer that most of us have been feeling the impacts of. So that's a really relevant one as well. But also droughts and mental health impacts. We call this eco-anxiety. Any of those can be part of your story. We can go to the next slide. Perfect. And then this talks about some of the facts that you can incorporate into your story. So once you've thought of, you know, the main reason or the main couple of reasons why you care about climate change and the endangerment finding, you want to talk about the sort of facts. So the facts about climate change and our health are that climate change is related to asthma, worsened allergies, respiratory illnesses. It also increases tick-borne illnesses due to the migration and increases in population of ticks. So things like Lyme disease, if you're impacted by that, Heat exhaustion and heat stroke are another part of this. Adverse birth outcomes, again, mental health impacts. And then extreme weather, like we just talked about. The main fact here is that climate change is making extreme weather more frequent and more intense. So unfortunately, in 2024, last year, the US had 27 different climate disasters that each caused over $1 billion in damages. So, that's only going to continue to get worse unless we do something about it. Another really jarring fact that always sticks with me, if you want to talk about your children or their future, is that today's children are expected to face over 3 times more climate disasters than their grandparents. You can go to the next slide. And then we heard a lot about this throughout our conversations, but talking about environmental injustice is a part of a lot of people's stories. So lower income communities and communities of color bear the worst impacts of climate change. They're most likely to live near environmental hazards like petrochemical facilities. Again, like we've talked about this whole webinar, extreme weather can lead to chemical disasters, explosions, spills, all of that can lead to cancer and other serious illnesses for the communities in their way. And then we create this sort of vicious cycle of chemical disasters releasing more and more climate warming emissions that fuel global warming and more extreme weather. You can also talk about the corporate greed in all of this. So fossil fuel industry insiders are making record profits while they're putting our communities and our future in harm's way. We can go to the next slide. And then lastly, you just want to conclude your testimony, your written comment. We sort of use these terms interchangeably. You can use this one verbatim. Once again, I strongly oppose this proposal to rescind the endangerment finding. EPA, please fulfill your mission of protecting human health and the environment. You can visit that tiny URL. We'll follow up after this with the link to submit your comment. But visit tinyurl.com/submit-ef-comment, and that'll lead you directly to the EPA docket where you can submit your comment. And it can be as long or as short as you would like. The more personal, the better. If you're short on time, you can visit our website and submit a petition instead. That's sort of like a template guide to sending a comment to EPA as well. But with that, I'm going to close things out. Remember to submit your comments to the EPA by September 22nd. If you have any questions, you can reach out through the mobilized feedback form that you'll get after the event. And we'll do our best to get back to you when we can. We want to be really helpful in this process and make sure that it's as accessible as possible. Thank you again to our wonderful speakers, Dominique, Cynthia, Joe, and Leo. And we appreciate all of you for joining us today. We hope you learned something and hope that you take some action. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.